So, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us for this virtual conference on global taxing rights. We're really delighted to be partly holding this event on this important issue, but also to be piloting this approach. Our annual conference, which takes place in different places around the world. So next October will be in Senegal. Is probably by some distance the biggest climate impact we have. So we're really keen to see if we can get a virtual conference fully up and running. If we have technical issues, please do bear with us, but we're hoping everything will go perfectly smoothly, and we'll be able to really get into this issue. I'm going to start with a few remarks and then introduce our first keynote speaker and first panel. I should say the hashtag for this is global tax rights. If you're tweeting or elsewhere on social media, please do use that. When we started planning this event about 6 months ago, it looked like progress was reasonably smooth, and that we might even have some broad consensus on both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 of the OECD tax reforms by this time, looking to the January meeting of the Inclusive Framework perhaps to sign off. But since then, things have got rather more exciting. Firstly, there's been a lot of pushback in the public consultation on especially Pillar 1, but also on Pillar 2. Then the agreement between the USA and France that seems to have underpinned the approach being taken has kind of fallen apart. The US has announced sanctions, and the French have said publicly they think the US may withdraw. Elsewhere, I think we've seen perhaps the unprecedented thing of the OECD questioning the unity of the G24 group and the position they've been taking. So lots of exciting moments and lots of space to see where the international tax rules may go. Given that we're now talking about unitary tax approaches that in some sense were ruled out by the League of Nations in the 1930s, this does feel like the biggest opening in the international tax rules for the best part of a century. Now, a key issue within this is the lack of clarity at the moment on the extent to which various proposals would actually reduce profit shifting, and the extent to which they would benefit different countries and countries at different levels of per capita income. The uncertainty about that is partly resting on the opacity problem that we face. Although there is now an OECD standard for country-by-country reporting by multinationals, that data is not public. The US has published aggregate data. The OECD will publish a full set of aggregate data in January, we're told, but at the moment it's difficult for independent researchers to really move ahead in trying to model the effect on revenue redistribution that these proposals could have. So the first session today is really an effort to get greater clarity on that. And we have some great speakers presenting new research, including from the OECD, and I'll talk more about them when we get to that session. But we're going to be looking at those questions of the impact of revenue, whether or not the proposals really live up to the kind of expectations people may have. We'll then move later today into a session focused more on the politics of the process, the possible outcomes. In the programme, I've talked about 3 scenarios, one in which there's a very limited reform delivered, another in which the process falls apart, and a third in which there's a kind of resetting, perhaps an extending of the timeline in order to allow for more detailed analysis before agreement is reached. It'll be very interesting to hear the range of different expert views on where that might go, and of course from your views from the floor. But to go into the first session, we are delighted to have an opening keynote from a truly global figure and a leading economist and thinker. Jayati Ghosh is Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and also a commissioner of the the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRIT. Jayati's research interests are very wide-ranging, from the impacts of globalization, international trade and finance, to labour markets, macroeconomic policy, with a particular focus on poverty and inequality, including gender inequality. She's written any number of books and articles, for which she's received a whole range of prizes, including from the International Labour Organization. She's held a number of positions in India, in a number of commissions. She's also the Executive Secretary of the International Development Economics Associates Ideas Network, and has consulted widely for international organizations, including a whole set of UN organizations. And of course, as a very public thinker, Jayati writes regularly in all sorts of media. So we are really delighted to be able to welcome Jayati to speak. Let me just remind you that while Jayati is speaking, and indeed in the other sessions later on, within this software we're using, Crowdcast, there is a question box at the bottom of the screen. There's a chat box for chat, but also a question box where the questions that you put in can be voted up or down by other people, and we'll try and make sure we use the questions that people are most engaged with and put them to our speakers. So without further ado, let me hand over to Jayati. Jayati, thank you very much for joining us and welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, really. Thanks a lot. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be part of this experiment. And it's a new technology for me, but I think it has huge potential. And I think the possibilities of actually interacting with people all over the world in a way where we can get a lot of knowledge and share a lot of information, it's amazing. So I hope this works. So I don't know if you can see what I've got on the screen already. It's basically, you can. So I'm really just going to give a kind of overview. And the idea is just to remind you of the issues. I know that most of you probably know all these issues very well, but it's just useful somehow to get them in context in a way so that we can move on with the more technical sessions. So this is really just like a basic framework. And forgive me if I bore you with stuff that you already know. But of course, the basic point, which all of us do know, which is why we're all participating in this, is that multinational corporations get away with murder, in the sense that they actually end up paying much, much lower taxes than local companies anywhere in where they operate. And overall, they cost the governments across the world huge amounts of money, which in turn means that they really manage to get larger and larger profits and therefore increase their market power and political power, even as they deprive governments of critical sources of revenue. And they do this through what is called base erosion and profit shifting, which basically means that when they are trading across their subsidiaries, they use this thing called transfer pricing, which is the price at which subsidiaries trade with each other, to shift the prices, to change the prices in ways that move the profits to the lowest cost, the lowest tax jurisdictions. And basically, things have got even worse. They were always bad, but they have deteriorated much more in the last 20 years with digital companies. Some of them make billions of dollars of profits, tens of billions of dollars of profits, but they pay barely any taxes anywhere. And of course, the growing role of intangibles for all multinational companies, the fact that they can use intellectual property and all kinds of other things to claim that actually the revenues are being generated in tiny little offices with maybe 10 people in some tax haven, has greatly enabled this. So this is something which has been known for a while, but it has now become so large, so obscene in a way, that it really cannot be ignored by anyone anymore. The revenue losses are huge. There's a Christian aid estimate of around 445 billion. I think, sorry, the latest estimate was slightly lower, 428 billion, but still. The IMF has estimated as much as 500 billion. I'm sure you'll get more estimates over the course of this afternoon when this seminar proceeds. But what does it mean? It means that, basically all our governments say that they're short of funds, that they don't have the money to meet anything. Forget climate challenges, which will definitely require vast, major investments by governments across the world, but they don't have the money to ensure better labor market opportunities. They don't have the money for social protection. They don't have the money for any of the social and economic rights that citizens demand. And because of the whole need for fiscal discipline, this inability to tax translates into much, much lower public spending, which affects not just the economy and economic growth, but it affects conditions, it affects your welfare, it affects everything. And it also creates an uneven playing field, because as I told you earlier, multinational companies basically don't pay taxes that domestic companies have to pay. So there's already an imbalance in the market. They already have much greater access to not just higher profits, but an ability to control markets. And therefore, they can become even more concentrated. And it adds to concentration in a very, very unhealthy way. Another thing is that, therefore, all these other indicators that we use all the time, the extent of trade, exports and imports, FDI, profits, all of these are actually misleading because they're not actually stated properly. These tax avoidance strategies of multinationals really mean that they are overstating FDI, that they're understating or overstating both imports and exports. It's called trade misinvoicing, that the profits in a particular country are actually not really in that country. They're generated somewhere else, but the bookkeeping is in the other country. And it really means that we can't actually trust a lot of the data that we have. So here's one estimate. It's a recent study by Torslov, Weir, and Zuckman, which has basically used this global database called Orbis to estimate the kind of profits that big multinational corporations make. These are, three of them are digital companies, one of them is Nike, and it's comparing them with the sum of the observable profits. So the blue lines that you see, the blue columns, are the total global profits, the true profits of these companies. The red columns are what they claim they get in the major jurisdictions in which they are taxed. That's leaving out the tax havens. So just look at that difference. You will see that it's a tiny, tiny proportion in most of these companies, for all of these companies. In fact, Facebook, there are no observable profits to speak of. Google's are minuscule. Apple's are also minuscule. Nike's were slightly observable and have disappeared by 2016. So basically, the difference is because the subsidiaries where these firms make the bulk of their profits are not visible in Orbis. They're tax havens. I want to remind you that these tax havens include the US and the UK, which are very big tax havens, and they include the Netherlands, Switzerland also. I also mentioned that many of the other indicators that we use actually are completely misleading because we don't have the genuine data. And here's another example from another recent study. This is from the IMF, and perhaps we'll get more detail on this later on, about phantom FDI. So this one, the purple columns are the genuine FDI, and the green columns are the phantom FDI. Now, just look at this. The percent of global FDI, it's crazy. The phantom is dramatically outpacing the genuine FDI. And the share of global inward FDI, which is now phantom, is almost 40%. So it's just showing you that the rate of growth of phantom FDI is much, much faster. And most of this is only for tax avoidance purposes. So countries that are celebrating a lot of FDI inflow because they think it's going to bring jobs and technology and network effects and all of that, many of them don't even realize that it's all just bookkeeping. It's all accounting devices for tax avoidance. And I think that's another important element that we often forget. Okay, so what do we do? And this is where all the discussions that Alex mentioned earlier become very important. There's basically a very simple idea. It's called unitary taxation. And it means that, look, multinational corporations are functioning as one entity. They are behaving like one company wherever they are. And so we should treat them as one entity. We should treat them as one company and tax their global profits. And therefore, the proposal is that we take the global profits of the multinational. For example, with Apple, I mean, all the things that we looked at earlier, we would take the total of that big line, the big column, and say that we will distribute that, we will apportion that across countries according to a formula. We are suggesting a formula based on sales, on employment, and for digital companies, users, because that's now consumers are, in fact, the commodity really that is being traded for the digital companies. Now, this is actually something which is already on in the United States. As you probably know, in the United States, state governments have the ability to set both direct and indirect taxes. And so in the United States, they already use this system of unitary taxation with a minimum tax rate and then a distribution of the national profits of that company across the different states according to their shares, according to the formula. Now, obviously, this really requires a global minimum tax rate, because if some company decides that, that they're going to have a much, much lower rate than all the others, then yes, there will be this attempt by multinationals to claim or to shift a lot more of their activity there. ICRIT, of which I'm a member, we have suggested 25% as a reasonable rate, and it's a kind of base rate which is existent in the EU, for many countries in the EU and many other developing countries as well. And then the idea is that each country would impose taxes on the multinationals that are operating in their jurisdiction based on the shares according to that formula. The amazing thing is that after several years of pushing for this, when it was simply not taken on board, the OECD BEPS initiative inclusive process has actually accepted that basic idea. And that's a tremendous advance, as Alex was saying. It's a very exciting time in that sense, because it means that something can actually happen. But there are some flaws in this proposal. Now, in fact, some of these flaws, these features, almost make the whole exercise pointless. So what's the first flaw? Well, it wants to use only sales as the basis for distributing profits. Why is that a problem? Because many developing countries obviously consume less of multinational output, definitionally, because they have lower incomes and the size of the economies are smaller and all of that. But nonetheless, they produce many of these goods. So in fact, to be fair, you should actually at least include employment as an element in that formula. So that would be one important thing. The OECD, one of the proposals also has been for a much lower tax rate, as low as the Irish rate of 12.5%, which would again make it much, much lower in terms of the shareable taxes that other countries can employ. But there are other, and in a way, bigger problems with the current OECD proposal. And the biggest proposal is this arbitrary separation that they've suddenly introduced between routine and residual profits. And the proposal is that only residual profits will be subject to unitary taxation. Now, what on earth are routine and residual? That's already a bizarre thing, right? Because it's not something which is normally done in any tax structure in any country. So where is all this residual stuff coming from? Well, the idea is that the OECD will define what residual profits are, because there will be some profits that will be seen as routine for multinationals, and then some proportion of that residual profit will be allocated to different countries, to different market jurisdictions to tax. Now, that basically means what? That current transfer pricing rules will apply for all routine profits. And also, that the part of residual profits that is not allocated to market jurisdiction will also be subject to those transfer pricing rules. In other words, these current transfer pricing rules, which allow all that profit shifting that I was talking about, they would remain in place for the most of MNC profits. We will end up with a tiny little amount that will then be distributed according to this unitary taxation. It's almost as good as doing away with that scheme. Now, this, frankly, there is absolutely no economic justification for this, because there's no notion of a routine profit. Profits are always, anyway, net of all kinds of costs and interest and everything. And you're taxing a net income. So your total profits are your net income. And it also defeats the entire purpose. So almost nothing will be subject to the global tax. What's bizarre is that there is no country in the world that makes a distinction between routine and residual profits in its corporate taxation. So how come suddenly in an international system we're creating this random distinction, which really has no economic justification? Then, of course, there are problems with the OECD process itself. It's absolutely true that the inclusive process has been bigger in that they have brought in many developing countries, but it still seems as if they have relatively little negotiating power. So there were three major proposals on the table for the OECD this time around. The US proposal, the EU proposal, which driven also by France, and the G24 group of developing countries. The G24 is a group based in the Bretton Woods Institution of Developing Countries. It seems that the G24 proposal, which wanted employment to be included in the formula and many other things, it was not taken on board at all. And that is a problem. That suggests that despite the fact that they've been admitted to the high table, their job is basically to shut up and listen rather than to be equal players in the discussions. Then, of course, there are many asymmetries within the process. First of all, there's an asymmetry of information, that is access to data. The data really, most of the data affecting all of this is with the OECD countries and with some powerful actors within the OECD countries. And developing countries that have asked for more transparency, more sharing of data, etc., are not getting it. And then, of course, there's the ability to analyze the data. Many developing countries simply don't have the expertise or the technical know-how and capacity to analyze the vast quantities of data that they would need to understand to actually make for a particular case. Then, of course, there are asymmetries of size and geopolitical strength. Very, very large economies obviously have much more bargaining power. Stronger geopolitical countries that are stronger geopolitically also have much stronger bargaining power. And a whole bunch of poorer countries who would be much more affected by this process, they have very little in that sense in terms of negotiating strength. Finally, there are asymmetries in terms of the interests of different kinds of countries. Exporters of capital have very different interests from importers of capital. Trump is really angry with France for trying to impose a unitary tax on digital companies because of the fact that this is affecting US-based multinationals. Exporters of technology have different interests from importers of technology. Countries which have concentrated intellectual property in their jurisdiction have different interests from those that are the producers of the output that these multinationals actually produce. And so all of these different asymmetries have to be recognized. Ideally, they have to be reduced and they have to be counterbalanced. That could happen if, for example, the OECD actually made available all the data that developing countries have been asking for all the time, provided technical assistance to countries that do not have the ability to actually analyze all of that data, recognize this differential geopolitical strength and put in a system that doesn't overtly play to those strengths and so on. So this hasn't happened so far. There's always hope, but clearly this is something that needs to be recognized, reduced, and counterbalanced. But there are also other problems when you think of equity and fairness. Now, if it's a global system of taxation, if these are global corporations, then in terms of distributing tax revenues, how should you actually do this? Should you do this, for example, by saying that, well, if it's a global tax, then every person in the world deserves an equal share of it? A per capita allocation, for example? Or should it be based on formula? Now, we know that per capita is unlikely. It's politically unfeasible at the moment, for sure. And we don't have that kind of cooperation and generosity in international negotiations at the moment to achieve it. But even a formula that disproportionately allocates to certain countries based on the fact that they consume more because they have higher per capita incomes and they are homes to the big multinationals, that too is essentially unfair. Now, in that kind of a context, I think it's important that developing countries actually negotiate as a group. So essentially, it's absolutely crucial to bring these issues and concerns to public attention, both in developed and in developing countries. It has the potential to benefit citizens everywhere. But obviously, multinationals have huge lobbying power. We've seen that in the last minute insertion of this routine and residual profits in the OECD discussion. And there are vested interests of some governments who actually are tax havens. So we have to recognize this, and it's only with a very broad public movement and mobilization that we would actually be able to confront this. But thank you for listening, and I hope we get questions because I would love to discuss all of this further.
Thank you, Jayati. That's really a fascinating look into the questions here. Like, I have a couple of questions I really want to kind of put to you and that reflect some of the points you've raised there. So one of them is this. I mean, you've laid out the scale of the revenue benefits that there could be, including perhaps especially for lower income countries, but really across the board.
Yeah.
The size of this problem is clear, and so the benefits of dealing with it. You've set out how unitary tax provides a relatively simple and powerful way of dealing with that. It kind of begs the question: why hasn't this just been done before? I mean, what are the obstacles to making the progress that seems to be within reach?
Yes, it is remarkable, isn't it? Because you think this is win-win for people and governments everywhere. If it's so easy and obvious, why aren't they doing this? Why do they persist also in an unequal playing field for their own domestic companies relative to multinationals? And I think the answers are first in terms of the massive lobbying power of multinationals. You have to remember that it's not just in their home countries. Of course, it's very strong in their home countries, but they are so much larger in size than most of the countries that they operate in, that they are really able in a way to push them around. And a little threat can actually have a massive difference. So there is a whole perception which has taken root in government that somehow you have to keep attracting capital. And the only way to do that is to create conditions in which they will be happy. I think what they don't recognize, what governments and people across the world don't recognize, is that there is really a significant power in this, where if enough countries do it, not even all, but if enough countries do it, they will have no choice but to actually comply. And I think it's in a sense the lack of the fear of the unknown and the lack of recognition that you have actually more power than you realize.
Okay, so that perhaps takes us to another question then. I mean, I wonder if the chances for countries to realise that power exist within the OECD process, or do you think ultimately we're looking at some future process that would be beyond the OECD, perhaps at the UN, where those power dynamics might be more clearly laid out?
I think the ideal process would be in something like in a UN-based system. There is already a UN tax committee, but it really needs to become an intergovernmental committee with certain powers. And if you do that, then you can actually have the ability of many countries to get together as a group. And that has so much more impact in terms of the ability to confront and cope with the massive lobbying power of multinationals. So I do believe that, yes, the OECD process, it's more inclusive than it was. It was actually exclusive earlier. So it's definitely better than it was, but it's still inadequate. And it definitely does need a global kind of system. It definitely needs a global basis, and the United Nations forms, at the moment, the best institutional home for that truly multilateral basis.
Thanks. It's I guess a question, the politics of that will develop in the last session today. Coming back to the perhaps one of the more technical elements, you talked about the difference between a unitary approach that reflects only the sales of multinationals and so favours the market economies, against one that has perhaps a more balanced formula with sales and employment, reflecting also where the production takes place. Is that argument, in some sense, the modern equivalent of effectively an argument about where the value of colonial production chains go? Is this really the kind of the current day version of colonial exploitation, and that question of whether we include employment as well as sales, the equivalent of whether the colonies should also benefit or only the imperial powers?
Yes, it is. I mean, when you look at it, the whole global value chain thing is essentially about very little so-called value being created in the place where the commodities, the output is actually produced. The famous smiley curve, where all the value is in the pre-production and post-production parts. And the lowest value is where it's actually produced, where it's all happening. And there are classic examples, right? The Apple iPhone or the Barbie doll, or you name it. Everything where the production, where it's actually produced, both the employer and the employee of that jurisdiction, they produce maybe, they get maybe 10% of the value at most. And the rest of it is all taken by effectively rents, intellectual property in terms of the design and planning and the organization, and marketing, distribution, and all of that. So yes, very much this is a colonial pattern, except sort of refined for the 21st century.
So, okay, one last question then, and this is perhaps the bigger one. Should we see the glass as being predominantly half full because, after 80, 90 years, we finally have unitary tax back on the international policy agenda? Or should we see the glass as predominantly half empty because ultimately the decisions are still being made within this forum, which is a rich countries club, because the power of lobbying is still, it seems, dominating over the power of a demand for tax justice. How are you feeling about that? As we look forward, should we be looking forward with optimism or more with caution?
So I would use a different analogy. I think it's more like, when you play with a kitten with a ball of string and you dangle the string in front of the kitten and, they're grabbing at it. And then just when they're about to grab it, you move it. So I think we are that kitten. We really have to be able to grab it. It's tough because the idea is to keep moving it. I mean, yes, the goalposts are shifting. Suddenly they'll introduce something new. You say, we're giving you what you want. Here, you've got unitary taxation. Calm down, relax. It's all wonderful. And then they say, but it's routine and residual. So we have to be able to grab that string. I think that's the analogy.
So I very much hope that that we can grab that string. Jayati, thank you so much. That's been fascinating, really valuable to hear from you. We will move to the first session, but to sort of think of the virtual conference as a real one, there'll be a little minute in between where we invite the panelists up onto the stage. So we will disappear from this screen for just a minute and then be back with you. Probably not time for a coffee, but there will be a break between the first and second sessions. But for now, Jayati, thank you, and I look forward to continuing.
Thank you, Alex.